Productive Pastor 101, How I Write a Sermon in 6 Hours. Welcome back to the podcast, friends. Chad Brooks here with Productive Pastor, your place for healthy ministry through strategic productivity. Got a banger of an episode queued up for you, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but just a couple things in the intro. A couple things. It's been super busy lately. Super busy. You might have been saying, Chad, your release schedule's gotten a little off. Yes, my friend, it has. I know that, but that leads into something exciting. For the last 2 years, I've been bivocational, have been serving at least one, sometimes two local churches. We've had Productive Pastor and all the stuff that comes along with that, my private coaching practice, working with partner passions and partnership. And over the last 10 months, I've been working half-time. That's Methodist language. Is in our conference office as the congregational vitality strategist. And I'll share a link inside of Productive Pastor Community on this, but as of July, I will be full-time doing that. It's going to be weird. It's going to be the first time in 13 years, I think. Yeah, 13 years I've not been preaching weekly. That changes a lot of things. Changes up so many things, but this last month, I've had a lot of work. I've pretty much been working full-time there for the last month, taking care of some exciting, cool stuff, because in that job, one of the things I'm over is new church development in our conference, and we're launching a new church, and so been a lot of conversations, meetings about what that looks like, but things will change. But the podcast is still here. Productive Pastor is still a very real thing. But I want to just talk to you about one quick thing real quick coming up this Memorial Day, as I will have some very special content that people have been actually asking for a very long time coming out in course format this Memorial Day, but it's going to be unique because it's only going to be available Memorial Day weekend. The cart will open on that Friday, and the cart will close on that Monday. And then when it's gone for 12 months. You won't be able to access it. And it's not going to be very expensive either. It's going to be a very inexpensive course that I'm excited on turning loose, letting you all see that. If you want to keep up, if you don't want to miss that wait list, and just the wait list emails before the cart opens have tons of awesome value. I'll be announcing all this, but if you don't want to miss out on the wait list, this is what you need to do. Go to the show notes, revchadbrooks.com/PPP/101, and just sign up for the Productive Pastor email list. That's where you will find out the moment the wait list opens and you get over a week of, all killer, no filler content about what this special release course will look like. So make sure you go and sign up at the email list for that. So let's get going into the content today. How to write a sermon in 6 hours. Now, for over 10 years, I've been preaching weekly. And it didn't always take 6 hours. It used to take a lot longer. And in fact, there have been times in ministry where I had the absolute luxury, to spend a significant amount of time in sermon work each week. I think I used to do like 20, 25 hours easy because I could. And I did. I was, the first 3 years out of seminary, I was an associate pastor at a mid-sized church that had a contemporary congregation that I ran. And so really the only thing I had to worry about was pastoral care and preaching. And I was also just fresh out of seminary and still developing so much of my own voice, my own approach. But I did spend a lot of time doing message preparation back then. So the time thing, it's not that it's less important, but it also has to be really, really focused because of some changes in ministry over the last few years. And I got to tell you what, it took me probably 6 to 8 months to go from, expecting around 12 to 15 hours of sermon preparation a week to 6 hours or so in sermon preparation each week. And like I said, not less important. It's become more focused. And there's a few ways to become more focused. Number one is this: I've got too many books. I've got a bunch of books, and I read all the time. But I've gotten to know my commentaries a lot better. I'm preaching through Acts right now for the next few months. And when I started off that first week, I think I had 12 different commentaries taken down off the shelf. And one of the things I did starting on week 3 was I went through all the commentaries I had read through and had not found the least bit helpful for where I am and what my communication is, all that kind of stuff. put them back on the shelf. I said, y'all are my friends, but I don't need you right now. I've gotten to know my commentaries so much more over the last couple of years since I've been having to hone in on this. The second thing has been part of that has been the system. I've learned how I preach, and you have to learn how you preach. And you can only do that by putting the time in and then beginning to analyze your sermons a little bit and realizing, okay, this is what a good sermon looks like for me. These are the things that are there as part of a good sermon. These are the typical preaching outlines I tend to preach with, and I've developed out realizing I've got 2 or 3 ways I preach, and I've been able to systematize what those things are, and that has helped me so much because I'm prepping to preach. I've used that phrase a lot. Back when I was teaching a course called Preaching Through Distractions, we spent a lot of time talking about prep to preach, but my systems just significantly got enhanced. Another thing that kind of helped out with this was limitations. So I went from a congregation of a church plant in a brand new building where I had a gigantic, I think it was 28 feet wide screen behind me. I relied on visuals so much, and I was picky about my visuals. I made my own visuals, and because of that, I wasn't just writing sermons. I was also having to create, upwards sometimes of 30 to 45 slides in a very specific way that I like to use slides. And so my presentation design and my communication design took a significant chunk of time. That also, the way I preach was different because I could use longer quotes. I could have more complicated things to explain and have a graph or some image or that sort of a thing. I'm now preaching in a country church with around 18 people on Sunday morning, and we're lucky if the microphone works. So those limitations trimmed out easily 5 to 6 hours of preparation time each week. And the last thing, this is all the pre-qualifications, I guess I'm calling it. The last thing is this: your sermon calendar is everything. When you know what you're going to be preaching on, and I'm going to put some links in the show notes to some other episodes I've done about sermon calendars and preaching, that sort of a thing. But your sermon calendar is one of the biggest tools you have, because when you know what you're preaching on in advance, you see things, you hear things, you think through things, and you can just go ahead and drop it inside of that calendar. That's why I keep my sermon calendar on Trello, because I just keep it chock full of just stuff I come along the way. Because like I said, I'm already reading. Like I'm seeing things and I'm thinking about things, and I've got to a place to drop them into. So I'm never starting with a blank slate on Monday morning when I start working specifically on that week's message. And here's the thing, about the sermon calendar, one of the reasons the podcast has gotten a little shaky lately is I was done with my podcasting calendar. I had no content that I was prepping on, working on for the future. So my mind wasn't going to those places. I wasn't taking notes over the week about an episode I knew that was upcoming, all that kind of stuff. Friends, it's, your content calendar. Let's go ahead and call it that. There was an episode way back in the day in the first iteration of the podcast about thinking all things we have to write and create over the course of the week being a content calendar. So just kind of always shooting from the hip when you're communicating to people, even at the level of what am I going to be communicating about, it makes things more difficult. So that sermon calendar is just the absolute huge big thing that's out of there. That's the pre stuff. Now let's get into the week. Chad, explain these 6 hours to me. This sounds a little unbelievable. Well, this is what I do. Like I said, I've been doing this for over 10 years, been doing this weekly for 13 or 14 years. And I also had a stint as an associate pastor at a church where it wasn't uncommon to hear from the senior pastor on Saturday afternoon and say, hey, listen, and he drove in like 45 miles to church on Sunday saying, hey, I've gotten really sick this weekend, or my wife, who both of them were elderly and she had some health problems. He's like, hey, I can't make it in for Sunday morning. Can you preach? Or he'd tell me Sunday after church at lunch, he'd text me and say, hey, I don't think I can come back in tonight. Can you preach? And so even back then in seminary, almost 20 years ago, what I found myself doing is having to develop this approach and these systems. And so in a lot of ways, I kind of went back into that. So let's go through the days of the week and what this looks like. I like to have my sermon done on Thursday afternoon. So I think about this through 4 movements. It's that whole prepping to preach. And so the days even have a theme and a focus as well. So the first thing on Monday, I just focus on the text on Monday. I'm going to read that text, multiple times. I'm going to try to get it fresh. Or I'm going to go back in my Bible, and if I've thought about it and journaled through it over this year already, I'm going to look at the notes and the ideas I have there. It's also not uncommon for me to go back to an old Bible. Some of you know this, that every single year I get a brand new hardback Cambridge wide margin, and I start that Bible on January 1st, and I finish that Bible on December 31st, and it goes on the shelf. It's not odd for me to go pull down 4 or 5 years of Bibles behind me and look at this text and say, okay, what are you seeing? What are you understanding is important here? Because especially sometimes I will come into that Monday not really knowing which direction we might need to go with this text. Sometimes I've got a really, really clear picture there. But even if I'm dumbfounded, just spending some time reading, asking questions, doing some inductive Bible study, taking some notes, thinking through things, I can begin to see stuff come out. Or I'll see this in the old Bibles as well. Then I'll plop into my sermon worksheet. Friends, the tried and true Productive Pastor Sermon Worksheet. I'll have a link to that in the show notes where you can get that for free. I'll go through that, and that sermon worksheet is designed to begin capturing the big picture information and for my brain to start working. After that, I begin, thinking through the questions, stuff. I will be able to come up with a big idea or a Monday moment. I will begin to start slowly beginning to see an outline and what outline this might fit into, or how I might be able to communicate the one or two things that I think are absolutely critical through this. And so I begin making some rough outline notes. I'm there, but I don't open up any resources or nothing. I just focus on the text. And I typically spend an hour or two, usually an hour and a half, 2 hours on Mondays on the passage for the week, just taking it apart, dissecting it as much as I can, asking as many questions as I can, thinking about it devotionally. I might have already thought about this passage devotionally, read through it that year, and if I did, there's a highlight mark that tells me what day I wrote about this in my journal. So I'll go into my journal and see what I said there. So you can see all these things I have in front of me to help me have as much information that comes out of my mind, out of my heart, that the Spirit has said to me about that text. And when I'm done, I'm done. So Tuesday is the research day. Tuesday is a solid 2 hours. That's where I'm going to spend like hardcore, deep work, focused time. And I'm going to stick to my plan. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start answering any of the questions I might have had that I'd raised up the day before. I will do word study in a quick way. I've got a worksheet I use for that. I've got a bunch of sermon worksheets that you might see in the future one day, because they're all still pretty personal and private and tailored to what I do. But I'll go in and I'll do some word study. And then I begin reading commentaries. I begin looking up dictionary articles, and I'm taking notes this whole time. I'm writing down, I'm taking notes. And one of the things I've done is I probably did this starting 7 or 8 years ago, is I've got a color code that I use inside of my sermon notes. And I begin marking stuff up, but what I'm also doing is marking where things might fall on the outline, because I'm always outlining. It's not odd for, especially back in the day when I was spending 10 to 15 hours on a sermon, it wasn't odd for my sermon to probably have 6 or 7 outlines as I'm slowly thinking through and working through stuff. But I'm now I might have 2 or 3, but I'm always outlining, and I've got the color orange in my sermon notes immediately is making an outline note, and then I have a grid that I use for the different sermon outlines that I like to preach off of, to where I can just make a note of this is where this might fall on the outline. So it might say 1, 2, 3, or 4. Then it might get to the point where it's saying like 3A, 3C, 4B, that kind of stuff. So as I'm reading things, I'm looking at my outline, I'm seeing this in front of me, and I'm always researching towards the larger point. This is where when you figure out what commentaries are useful for you in the moment, and which commentaries might be not useful for you. I'm a huge church history nerd, and earlier this year I ordered all 5 volumes of Yaroslav Pelikan's church history. And so I started preaching through Acts. I got super stoked because he has a commentary on Acts, and so I went and got it. And it was on week 2 I realized, as much as I love Pelikan, as much as I found it helpful in the past, his work on Acts is not helpful for the things I'm trying to communicate now to the church. So I put it back up on the shelf. I realized this might be fun to read. This might be entertaining, but it's not helping me get towards that goal. So Tuesday is the big research day. I spent a solid 2 hours on it. I move into Wednesdays. Wednesdays is for writing, and I do this in the morning, but it probably only takes me an hour. What I try to have when I sit down on Wednesday is I try to have what I would call an 80% outline. like it's pretty much done. And so what I do that day is I just write my manuscript out. I mean, I'd still do like a paper manuscript inside a GoodNote 6. I write things out. I write out the whole manuscript. I'm aware of, because of the outline, of where I might need to fill in some gaps with a quote or with an illustration or with an idea. And I make sure I kind of, massage all of that together. But I get my outline done in Wednesdays. That's an hour. That's pretty much probably an hour. Now, fourth, on Thursdays, and this is the day that really can get hairy, especially if I'm traveling. Because a lot of times if I'm traveling on the road, I'm traveling on Tuesdays and Thursdays. But on Thursday, I like to get an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours in. Because this is what's going to happen. I'm going to make sure that outline sounds really good. Then I'm going to start working, making sure my transitions are clear. I'm going to spend time thinking through the conclusion, because that is the place I'm always trying to grow in my preaching, is my conclusions and my applications. Now, here's the thing. I might go into AI here. And let me tell you how I do this. What I do is I use Pulpit AI. I love Pulpit AI. It creates content based off of the things that you input into it, and you can upload an MP3 file into Pulpit AI. If I'm really, really, really struggling with my application and my conclusion, I will preach the message I have, upload it into Pulpit AI, and then start beginning asking it questions about application and conclusion and that sort of thing. And so sometimes that's what I need to make sure I get the final document the way I want it to. Then I go through and I mark it up. Because remember those color codes I told you about? I have color codes that mean certain things inside of my manuscript. Green is always for scripture. And so if it's going to be a scripture piece, I make sure I have green in there so I can see it at a moment's glance. If it's a heading change inside of the 2 or 3 outlines I like to use, I will use purple for that so I can tell when I am transitioning. Back when I was still preaching with screens, I had a slide op moving the screens forward, and what I would end up doing is I would have a blue box in the manuscript that had what slide number it corresponded to. So I would print out a copy of that manuscript. A lot of people ask me why I'm still a manuscript preacher. And it got drilled into my head for years when I had slide ops working as part of the worship team, for them to know this is when the transition has to happen. And so my old school manuscripts from back in the day were absolutely covered in information for when the slide op needed to change. I would do that work then only after preaching it a few times, but I'll preach that final manuscript one more time. Just make sure I know it well enough to feel comfortable walking into the pulpit on Sunday. Then I'm done. Saturday night, sometimes Saturday night or early Sunday morning, I will preach through it one more time again, but that will make things easier. Now, this last thing to tell you, and I'm hesitating to let people know about this because I know that some people are so absolutely critical about AI right now. But one of the things I have done is I have gone into the custom GPT section of ChatGPT, and I have a private sermon outliner that's full of information that I have put into it. And so what I did was I tried to describe those outlines as best as I could. I tried to attach very specific questions that I would have been asking myself inside of my own, some other preparation documents and worksheets I had made to help understand information, all of this. And I also have it gets outside a little bit, but it's primarily all about this information I put into it. And I put in like 3 or 4 hours one day of just inputting outlines and questions and bullet points and this kind of stuff and making it get to where it understands my outlines. If I am absolutely stuck, and I did this earlier this year, I was on vacation with my family. It was in December, and we were gone from like Tuesday, and we were going to fly back in on Saturday, and I had just not been able to get the stuff done that I wanted to get done. But it was a passage I had preached multiple times, and it was a part of Scripture I knew really, 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 really well. So I sat down that day with this custom GPT that I have on my private back end, and I did the whole sermon through making it ask me these questions and following one of I think I have 4 outlines that I preach from that I have inside of this custom GPT. And it probably went through about 30 to 45 questions that I gave it to ask me. And the only thing it does is it begins putting together all the information that it inputs that I inputted it through the answers to the question it asked me over time. And it took me about 2.5 hours. But when I was done, I had my sermon for the weekend, and it was a solid sermon. And it was my words. It was my ideas. I literally just used the AI GPT as like a conversation partner almost, who then would share me everything we talked about in a Word document after it. And so that's kind of another back end thing that I've found helpful when I'm having to, preach with squeezed time, which I do have a lot now. So that's a very different way, but I get it done in 6 hours. I'm able to think through what I need to think through, to do the research, to be faithful to text, be faithful to the people that I'm pastoring to, and also be faithful to what the Spirit's just kind of dropping in front of us, and to preach contextually appropriate, challenging messages for this very, very different mission context that I've had over the larger course of my ministry. So that's it. How to write a sermon in 6 hours. You got the information now. As always, thank you for hanging out and being part of this episode. Also, second, if you're interested in the Memorial Day course, I've not even told you what it is yet, but if you're saying, Chad, this sounds intriguing, go get on the Productive Pastor email list so you can get on the wait list on day one. Because the way that drip sequence works out, it's going to have an email that comes out to help you kind of get this idea, this content, this line of thinking as prepped as you can. But if you get on the wait list a day before the product releases, you'll miss out on all this content that's going out on very specific days. So go and jump on the wait list. If you're already part of the Productive Pastor email, you're going to get an email coming up that will allow you to opt into that wait list. So trust me, you don't want to also miss on the wait list content, and that's 100% free. Now you can get all that and do a pretty decent job and then never buy this course. But thank you for hanging out. Thank you for investing in your ministry health through strategic productivity. And I will be back in our next episode. I'm going to talk about why it's so hard to do small tasks. We'll be back next time. Thanks.